from that same perspective. We as a family are called to that same high standard of mutual submission. All have equal importance, equal worth, all have ultimate value in Christ, but different roles in that. And so we're going to look at that. So the passage goes on to identify the roles of submission of both wife and husband. Today we're going to follow the text as it goes into the 2 verses dealing with the wife, and then next week the husband. So the wife's role in submission in verse 22. This is not a popular conversation today to have. As a matter of fact, it's not a popular command of God today, mostly because of our selfish nature, either to want to not submit to somebody else or because it's been abused by other people on the other side of it, and we've been the brunt of that. Going to be said to the woman, your desire will be to rule over your husband, but he will rule over you. And so there's going to be this conflict that's going to happen because both people want their way, both people want to rule, both people want the other one to submit to them. And so that's where we live in the marriage relationship. And that presents then a conflict that's going to eventually destroy a relationship if it isn't dealt with well. So let's look at first at what submission is not. John Piper in this Momentary Marriage lists 6 things that submission is not. I'm just going to list a couple of them for you today because I thought they were extremely good. First one is submission does not mean agreeing with your husband on everything that he says. You know, God's given all of us the ability to think, and we're to use that ability to think in the midst of the marriage as well as everywhere else. Matter of fact, your husband is going to need your ability to think because he makes some bonehead plays sometimes. My wife will tell you that, I'm sure, if you asked her. And so to be able to respectfully disagree in the midst of that relationship is extremely important. Husbands are not infallible. Another thing he lists is submission does not mean avoiding every effort to change your husband. We are called, or women are called, wives are called to be helpmates to their husbands. We're not going to look at that fully today, but one aspect of it means that you will need to confront your husband when he's in sin. And so there's a process of doing that to bring about biblical change in his life to help him to continue to grow in Christ-likeness. And so submission doesn't mean that you're not going to be involved in that process. The wife is a follower of Jesus first and a wife second. Always going to make sure that we have the order straight. Sometimes we mix up the order. And so certainly if your husband's calling you into sin, that you are first and foremost a follower of Christ. Secondly, a wife. Submission then is also not an act of fear, but of freedom, as 1 Peter 3 says. We're going to look at that a little bit briefly a little bit later on. It means that submission is not coerced. It's free. It's a free gift. It's a free will of something that I'm going to do. And so a wife as a follower of Christ is free to put on Christ in growing in the way that he calls her to grow and submitting to her husband. So that's what submission is not. Let's look at what submission is on the other side of that. The Greek word, again, used here to arrange under. It carries a will and willingness to relinquish one's rights. And so it's a willing submission of one's independent rights for God's glory, for the advancement and the oneness of the relationship, and to accomplish the goals of that union. Okay, which means that husband and wife need to have been sitting down and having some conversation and goal setting in terms of what are we about? What is this relationship going to do? What are we supposed to be doing in our lives? And so hopefully you've had those conversations because then you can work together towards those goals. I love Wayne Mack's description in Strengthening Your Marriage. He says, in terms of submission, to be on your husband's team instead of working against him. Okay, so as a team, we have a set of goals that we're working towards, and we're working together to bring those goals about. And so part of that is the role of submission to her husband and to the goals that have been set forth in the midst of that. John Piper, in this Momentary Marriage, says submission is the divine calling of a wife to honor and affirm her husband's leadership and to help carry it through according to her gifts. Come together, then those gifts come to full fruit. Certainly you see that in Proverbs 31, where the wife is doing all kinds of different things to the benefit of the marriage and to accomplish the goals that couple has set forth. So that's all there. There's what submission is for us. A willing submission to one's independent rights for God's glory, advancement in the oneness in the marriage, and to accomplish the goals of that union. I think that gives us a good definition there. The passage goes on in Ephesians, verse 22, as unto the Lord. So she is to submit to her husband as unto the Lord. I've often wondered why Paul started with the role of wife rather than the role of husband. Because in my thinking, I would think, well, we need to get the husband on board, and he's got to get his role going and do all the things he's supposed to do and lead in the way that he should lead and all those kinds of things. And then the wife makes it easy for her to follow along and submit to her husband. But it doesn't start that way. He's going to sin. He's going to mess up. He's going to do bonehead things. You know, again, my wife would give testimony to many of those. But the wife is not trusting in her husband. She's learning to trust in her Lord. And there's a major difference in those two things. And so in the marriage, husbands and wives are to be working together for the glory of God. And if I might be so bold as to think about this in this term today, sometimes we're not very good at submitting to our husband because we're really not very good at submitting to the Lord either. And so we are to be working together for God's glory. Now, I need to make sure that you hear me say this today as well. We live in a sinful day where authority is abused. Matter of fact, often it's abused, even in the midst of a marriage. And so does this submission mean that wives are to put themselves in a dangerous position? And I want to make sure you hear this. No, it does not mean that. God has placed authorities over the husband for you to appeal to. Matthew 18, Galatians 6 certainly lay out a process for coming alongside somebody who's in sin, which would be your husband at that point. After going to your husband and making a wise appeal to him, making him aware of your sin, then you're going to take two others along if he doesn't, to protect wives, to protect children.